It was a bitter fight for supremacy in Asia. Japan had provoked the US in the Pacific War. The Second World War now spanned the entire globe. The two naval nations competed against each other on the world's largest ocean and fought battles on an unprecedented scale. The US had to transport their troops and their supplies across thousands of kilometers to regain control of Japanese-occupied Asia. It was a battle for every island, and even though airplanes played the most important role at that time, it was the soldiers on the ground whose blood was shed in the struggle for victory. On beaches, as well as in the jungle. On December 7, 1941, American broadcasters interrupted their program with a special report. Japan had attacked the American military base Pearl Harbor in Hawaii fully unprovoked. The Second World War had entered a new phase. Japan had signed Hitler's tripartite pact and was subject to severe economic sanctions. It was only a matter of time before the Japanese Empire would be at war with the US. The military leadership in Tokyo saw the American presence in the Pacific Ocean as a dagger to the throat. In 1940, the US relocated its Pacific Fleet to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And it is here that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned to destroy it. On Sunday, December 7, 1941, the Japanese combat unit arrived at the starting point for its attack. At 6 a.m., the 6 Japanese carriers turned toward the wind and started their planes, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighter planes. Just after sunrise, the aggressors bore down on the Marine base just as it awoke. It was 7:48 a.m. Shortly afterwards, the first report was sent to the Japanese leaders, Tora, 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 the code word used for the successful surprise attack. All 8 of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleships were moored in a double row along Ford Island. An ideal target. 2 waves of attacks. Approximately 350 planes took part in the Japanese airstrike. That left 5 U.S. battleships at the bottom of the harbor. The other 3 battleships, a cruiser and several destroyers, all sustained heavy damage. The Japanese destroyed 188 American planes at both the Hickam and Wheeler Air Force bases. The Japanese themselves lost a mere 29 planes in the attack. As the smoke began to clear over the naval base in Hawaii, the majority of the American Pacific Fleet had been destroyed. More than 2,400 U.S. soldiers were dead. America was now at war. The attack was intended as a liberating move for Japan. The empire's dependency on oil and other raw materials forced it to conquer more and more land as it expanded. Under Roosevelt, the U.S. tried to hinder this by means of economic sanctions. And lastly, an oil embargo. At first glance, the attack was a great success, or so it seemed. However, none of the American aircraft carriers were at the naval base at the time. The U.S. aircraft carriers Enterprise and Lexington were tasked with taking planes to the American bases on Midway and Wake, and were thus spared in the attack. In 1941, aircraft carriers were a relatively new weapon. Before that, battleships were considered rulers of the ocean. However, this symbol of power at sea proved to be virtually defenseless against relatively cheap airplanes. The attack on Pearl Harbor turned the U.S. battleship fleet into a fleet of aircraft carriers. A tactical and strategic revolution with far-reaching consequences for the future. U.S. President Roosevelt called the attack a day of infamy. On December 8, 1941, the U.S. declared war on Japan. Shortly after, and unprovoked, Hitler announced that Germany now found itself at war with America too. The Second World War had erupted into a global wildfire. Japan had already been on a military campaign for the best part of the previous 10 years, in Manchuria, in China, and in the Pacific region. Japan wanted to expand its imperial reach, and to do so, the country needed to gain unlimited access to natural resources. The attack against the U.S. fleet was meant to buy Japan additional time to conquer more land and thus secure its supremacy. The Japanese were expanding their sphere of control at the same time as the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Tenos soldiers were driving the Americans away from Wake Island in the Central Pacific, as well as seizing Dutch-controlled India from the Dutch. The land of the rising sun was waging a merciless war of conquest, and it seemed as though nobody could stand in their way. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese dominion had expanded to its largest size ever. The Japanese Empire was at the point of having uncontested control over the entire Far East, while displacing its European colonial rulers. Thailand, Hong Kong, and Singapore fell to the Japanese in just a few weeks. North Borneo, Indonesia, and the Philippines were the next to surrender. Emperor Hirohito's troops rampaged through the Pacific region like a hurricane in the months following Pearl Harbor. "I shall return," U.S. General Douglas MacArthur promised on March 12, 1942, as he was forced to flee the Philippines. In May, the remaining U.S. soldiers capitulate. Thousands of them died on their way to prison. The U.S. had no choice but to go on the defensive. President Roosevelt needed to show strength, and the Americans demonstrated their resolve by conceiving an unconventional plan. They were going to hit the enemy where it would hurt most: Tokyo, the Emperor City. The Son of Heaven would soon feel their wrath firsthand. On April 2, 1942, the U.S. aircraft carrier Hornet set course for Japan. There were 16 B-25 bombers tied down on board. In fact, the U.S. Army's airplanes were not designed for taking off from aircraft carriers. Returning to the ship and landing on deck was out of the question. Therefore, they had to fly to China after the bombing raid. The attack was drawn up and then executed by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, and his name went down in history for what came to be known as the Doolittle Raid. En route, the Hornet met the aircraft carrier Enterprise. It led Task Force 16, the escort for Doolittle and his planes. The crew on board the Hornet waited for its deployment. They strapped old Japanese friendship medals to their bombs as a greeting to the enemy. After Pearl Harbor, there was no longer any hope of friendship. On the morning of April 18th, the day of the attack, the fleet encountered Japanese forward post ships. The Americans managed to sink a few of these small ships. However, they were unable to stop them from sending radio transmissions. The U.S. unit had been discovered. Doolittle and Mark Mitcher, the Hornet's captain, decided to launch the bombers immediately. The first B-25, piloted by James Doolittle, took off 10 hours earlier than planned. The bombers set course for Tokyo. All the crew members were volunteers, and they knew what this premature launch meant. There wouldn't be enough fuel to make it to the part of China not occupied by the Japanese. The coup was a success. U.S. bombs fell on Tokyo. America, so the story goes, was able to strike back. Most of the bomber crews made it to non-Japanese controlled territory following the attack, and then headed home to the U.S. 2 men drowned during an emergency landing on water. 8 U.S. soldiers were taken to prison in Japan, 3 of whom were executed. Japan's leaders were shocked. The U.S. Pacific Fleet appeared to be more threatening than ever. Spring 1942, Chester Nimitz, U.S. Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific, sent a carrier strike group to the Coral Sea after receiving a warning from American radio intelligence. Admiral Yamamoto intended to attack the Americans in the Central Pacific. The Japanese planned to establish strongholds on New Guinea and the Solomon Islands in order to secure their territory. But it's here where the Americans are waiting to ambush them. This was the first sea battle in history that was fought at such long distance and using planes exclusively. The 2 fleets never came into view of each other. The War of the Aircraft Carriers had begun. The enemies launched their squadrons almost simultaneously. They met over the Coral Sea. The battle lasted for 2 days. The Americans sank the Japanese carrier Shoho and dealt heavy damage to Japan's brand new carrier Shokaku. A 3rd Japanese carrier, the Zuikaku, lost virtually all of its aircraft. The Americans also took a real beating. The carrier Lexington sank and the Yorktown was heavily damaged. But the Japanese advance was halted. With their attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had awoken a giant, now thirsty for blood. Within a few months, the U.S. industry switched to the production of military equipment. It was a new generation of aircraft carriers that was meant to reclaim power for the U.S., in particular in the Pacific. The ships were fast, had a long range, and could carry up to 100 planes. The Americans moved unit after unit to the Pacific via the Panama Canal. And they had a decisive advantage after having decoded the Japanese encryption system. U.S. codebreakers were now able to decode a large part of Japanese communications, and in doing so, prevented further surprise attacks. The scene of another encounter was a tiny spot in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the U.S. naval base Midway. Japan intended to provoke a fight with the American fleet with a diversion attack on the Aleutian Islands and by occupying Midway Island. Here, Admiral Yamamoto planned to bring about what Pearl Harbor failed to do: the complete destruction of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. On June 4, 1942, the Japanese launched their attack on Midway. The enemy's radio defense rendered Yamamoto's plan void. The Americans were prepared. The 3 aircraft carriers Hornet, Enterprise, as well as the Yorktown, which had been quickly repaired following the Coral Sea battle, waited in ambush 300 miles northeast of the Midway Atolls. Then, a U.S. plane discovered the Japanese advance. Commander Yamamoto and Admiral Nagumo, the commanding officer of the Japanese aircraft carriers, were completely oblivious to how dangerously close the enemy had